Yay! We're live. We're here. It's book launch time. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me this morning. I'm desperately excited, and I'm really, 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 really grateful to all the people that have just sent such supportive messages, and all the people that have taken pictures of themselves with my new book, Lighting the Way. Yay! Firstly, I want to just welcome everybody that's joining us on the live stream, and all of the people who have tweeted this morning. And I want to thank you all very much for giving up your time this morning. And I also want to give particular thanks to my guests. I've got some amazing guests this morning with me. So I have Diana Rasagi and Tom Sherrington and Hannah Wilson and Darren Chetty and Viv Grant and Kieran Gill and Mary Myatt. And they're all here this morning to share some wisdom with us. I also really want to thank Helen Diamond and Hannah and Clemmy at Bloomsbury, because they have been relentlessly positive, and they have lit the way for somebody who didn't think that it would be so smooth and straightforward to write a book and actually feel like they had been heard. So they've really made this possible, and I have much gratitude to them all. So I'm going to just talk for a few minutes about the reasons that I wrote Lighting the Way. Essentially, it was because I was a head teacher who felt for a long time that I definitely had the personal skills and the intelligence and the strategic mind and the heart to lead people well. But I always felt my utter fallibility. So it was there at night when I closed my eyes. It was written in an Ofsted report. It was an ever-present feeling of requiring improvement. And it was in the face, this feeling, of some exceedingly dominant narratives of what leadership should look like in schools. And I'm a bit of a queen, so feeling as though I required improvement didn't actually sit well with me. So I took a combination of coaching and reflection, and also evidence of what was actually working with the people that I worked with. I looked for the signs that they were saying, "You're doing this bit really well, Angie." And I set out to write a counter narrative. And luckily, I contacted Bloomsbury and said, "This is my counter narrative." And they said, "Yeah, that sounds good. That sounds like something that we haven't had. We have got a position for that." So this counter narrative, Lighting the Way, is one in which I attempted to foreground the need for an unshakable personal code of ethics, in which I set out to foreground self-awareness, in which I set out to foreground the need for compassion in our system, in which I set out to foreground kindness, in which I set out to say that there is a way to lead schools, and it might look a little bit different to the version that you've seen before. And it was because I wanted to be heard, and I wanted to say, I'm not requiring improvement. I'm more than those things. I'm much, much more than those things, that I wrote the book. But it was also because, looking back and looking at the kind of my entry point into the education system, I began to realize, and even more so now realize, that the times we are in are extraordinary. They are utterly extraordinary. And we cannot look around our communities, we cannot look around our schools and say that the old way, the existing way, is the only way to make headway here. So I think we're in times in which there can be genuine diversity of leadership, that people can light the way to a different way of doing things. And so this book is a kind of celebration of my attempts to do that, but also it's an invitation to other people, to other leaders, to light the way to what they feel might be a brighter and more brilliant way of leading schools. So that's why I wrote the book. But what I wanted this morning to be was more of a celebration about ethical leadership. So we have a little less than an hour together, and I have invited people who have spoken to me at different points and for different reasons, to come and introduce themselves, but also to talk for 5 minutes about what ethical leadership means to them. And they are all people that are still leading in the sector in some way or another. And they are all voices that I think will reflect a slightly different perspective. And I think that that's really helpful. Hopefully we'll have room for a few questions at the end. So if you have got any questions that you want to ask me or any of our guests, then I'm going to invite you to type them into the comments box. If we don't get to answer your questions, if for any reason my guests don't keep to the 5 minutes, and for any reason any of them go over by a few seconds, and we don't have enough time to answer questions, then if you type them in anyway, I will try to get to them somehow on Twitter, and I will tag in our guests as well. So hopefully we can get some of those questions answered. If you could just use the hashtag lighting the way, that would be fantastic. So, without further ado, I am going to stop talking and I'm going to hand over to Diana Asagi.
Thank you so much, Angela. I'm hoping that you all can hear me really well. It's just really, really great to get up on a Saturday morning. I got up at 6 a.m. I was on my bike and the gym that I built in the garden. I've done really well. I'm so pleased with myself. I've drunk horrible green spinach juice because I'm on this ridiculous diet. And here I am talking about ethical leadership. I mean, what else? What else do you need on a Saturday morning? When you said to me, Diana, would you speak on ethical leadership? I actually thought to myself, what other kind of leadership is there? What else? Why would you want to lead a different way? Especially if you're leading people. If you're leading baked beans or, inanimate objects, do what you want. But when we're leading the young people of the nation, right, let's just be clear on what we do here. We hold the nation in our hands. We hold the future of society in our hands. How can we not do it ethically? And I remember back to when I was head, and I had a situation in my first year, and it was toxic, tough, awful madness, just madness. But I had to take decisions, and the staff knew they were coming, and I tried to be open and transparent and a resilient leader, all those buzzwords, right? And frankly, it would have been easier for me to have said, you know what, have what you want. Let's just get it done with, yeah? And it was revolving around money, and basically staff realised that me, the old witch, doesn't do deals. I don't do deals, even though it is so much easier to say, take the money and leave, for example. And there were many, and then I was saying, but we would like to have a gentleman's agreement. You need to go find yourself a gentleman because this woman here doesn't do deals. It's not my money. It belongs to those little things walking about. They're called children. You know why this school exists? For them. So when you're asked to talk about ethical leadership and you remember back as to where you've come from, think, my goodness, if you choose to compromise at any time on what is right, going back from that is so difficult. And because what we do is the most important job in the world, everything stems from education. The fact that we've got doctors, lawyers, politicians, plumbers, electricians, it all stems from being taught by us. Society doesn't grow, doesn't move unless we do our job well. And if we do that with gaps in our ethics, there's no greater sin, I think, because we hold the absolute essence of who we are, society, in our hands as the leaders of our schools. They could never pay us enough. If they tripled our salary and quadrupled our credibility and our positive narrative in the press, it still wouldn't be enough for what we do. So being ethical is a courageous stance. I had to get the word in. It's a courageous stance because it's often easier to say, have what you want. You know what? For a peaceful life, above all, let's have peace. Sometimes you have to say, that's not right. It's not right now, and it won't be right in the future, and it certainly won't be right when I've left the school or I've left the organisation, and you are left with the consequences of my decisions. You don't like me? You know what? Okay. I'd rather you liked me because I need to be liked. But if you don't like me, I have to remember I wasn't voted in. This is not a democracy. I was appointed to lead, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. Love me, your life will be easier. I promise you. Hate me, that's your business. Or that's your business. Or love me, and I will step into your life, and you will have good stuff. But either way, we're going to do this right. When you start like that, people say, you know what, I can walk with you, I can align with you, or that's not for me. I don't like ethical leadership, I'm off. I've got to protect the young people in my school. And I do that by making sure the leaders in front of them have good ethics. What we do is far too important to do it any other way. Have I had 5 minutes?
And I think we've had 5 minutes, but I think basically, looking at the chat, everybody would listen to you talk forever on ethical leadership and courageous leadership. And thank you for saying that we are appointed, and we are appointed to lead. That's the point, right? And I think what you're talking to talks to this centrality of that my book is about. Autonomy is about developing the skills for leadership, because you have been appointed to get on and do it. Nobody's really going to tell you how, but you need to feel that you're autonomous to act, and you need to grow that. So thank you so much. If anybody has any questions for Diana, can you put them into the chat, and I will tag Diana into questions. Basically, Diana's got a sea of comments saying, "You're amazing." So if you have any questions for her as well, then put those in. As Penny says, fairly appointed and not unfairly anointed. Yes, that's where ethical leadership starts. Brilliant. Thank you so much, Diana. Okay, Tom, I'm going to hand over to you. You're on mute.
Okay. I'd be happy to give my 5 minutes to Diana. That's fantastic opener. It's hard to follow. Well, I was thinking about this. I think every leader I've ever known and worked with would think they were an ethical leader. And because, you come into this business with a sense of moral purpose. And I've never met a leader who didn't feel that sense really strongly. This is why we're here. So I think the question is really, why do sometimes we feel that there are things which are unethical and it's because people are under pressure, I think, and we come into conflict with competing pressures, and sometimes people cut corners, and they think, well, the best thing I can do is do my bit here, and then kind of forget about the system. And so sometimes things happen where people compromise the wider system for their own kind of limited sense of what's right in their own context. But I think there are people who I've met who I feel are ethical because of their sense of system leadership. So, for example, in a practical level, they're in the placement panel. They're happy to take the kids that need a place. They say, look, you're going to need some of mine. I'm going to take some of yours. They're our community. We're all part of the system. And that's ethical thinking. Whereas there are people who kind of opt out and say, well, I'm not part of that. And so I think that sort of behavior where, and it also applies to things like outcomes. There are people who sort of fiercely champion their own children, feeling that's the right thing to do. But sometimes it's at the expense of the integrity of the wider system there as well, in terms of competitive behaviors. So I've experienced that a lot, where people feeling in their own little world they're being ethical, but because of their competitive zeal, it feels that they aren't being a team player in a wider system, and that is I think an ongoing issue that we need to look at. There are other issues to do with things like staff workload. I mean, I think one of the most ethical things you can do as a leader is create a school where everyone wants to be there, where it's just a fabulous environment to work in. And this is where I think it sometimes becomes complicated, because you might have the intent, you might want to be a school which is inclusive, which is a wonderful place to work, but actually not everyone thinks that's true. And so Diana mentioned courageous. I think one of the most courageous things you have to do as a leader is be prepared to show humility and listen to what other people are saying about your own behaviors. And I've fallen into that trap when I was a leader, thinking I was being super ethical, but actually not really succeeding in creating a school which was actually as safe and kind of, where people could thrive in as much as they should have been able to. And so you think, well, I was trying to do the right thing, but I don't think I really listened enough to other people. And so therefore, I don't think I did as well as I should have. So we all would say, yeah, I'm an ethical leader, but are we? How do we know? We might put it on our badge and say, I'm an ethical leader. But I think you need to be able to be prepared to hear, do other people think you are? That's the question. And it doesn't matter what you think of yourself. If other people in the system, your partner schools in your local community, members of staff, children that you teach, if they don't see your behavior as ethical, then maybe you think, well, I'm not doing it right yet. So the intent is important, but we kind of have to deliver, I feel, and that's where the courage comes. Being able to hear that it's not good enough yet is one of the toughest things to do as a school leader, and actually where a lot of people come unstuck, because what happens is you start protecting yourself, defending yourself, putting the barriers up, and because you're feeling a bit wounded, and someone says to you something like, I don't think your staff is diverse enough, it kind of, your first reaction is to sort of look around and go, well, I did my best, I pointed the best people on the day, but actually, I don't have enough black teachers in my school, and I should have. And how did that happen? It's because I didn't do it well enough. I didn't think about the bigger picture every time I appointed somebody, and that's what's ended up in my school. So I think those sort of things are hard. So courage comes into that as well, doesn't it? A different type of courage. And I feel like, in a way, reflecting on my time as leader, that's kind of where I wish I'd had more. So I hope that's a useful contribution.
It's a really useful contribution, Tom. Thank you so much. And in particular, I'm so glad that you've brought this up. The muscle that I feel we all need to flex, and we all need to be prepared to flex, is the one that says, I think I completely cocked that up. I think I got that wrong. Looking back, actually, on my leadership, I don't think that bit was right, because we are so baked into a system that penalizes people saying, I think I might have got this wrong. We're either fearing liturgy or some kind of litigious kind of action on behalf of, like, communities or parents, or if I admit that I've got this wrong, then I'm going to get into trouble. Or we feel that our sense of self, which is so tied in our institutions to the institution that we are running, will be somehow damaged if we admit any failure. And it feels like failure is the most beautiful doorway through to absolute success, through to leadership. Like the minute that we can say, I think I got that wrong, actually I need to look at that again, is the moment that we become leaders. And I want all of the children and the staff that I work with to feel that is open to them, that getting it wrong, that looking back, that doing it anyway, and then looking back and saying, I don't know if I did that quite right, and then altering our course is available to all of us, because that's evolution, that's the development of the human being. So thank you so much for raising that, and I think that is that's the courageous action that I hope leaders are able to take. Okay, we're going to invite Hannah at ethical_leader to talk to us about ethical leadership from her perspective. Hannah, have you got, I think you might have some slides.
I have got slides. Yeah.
And actually, Hannah, before I pass over to you, I'm just going to say that to people who are watching, Diana is multitasking this morning. She's doing loads of things, not just drinking green smoothies and cycling on bikes and coming here to talk about ethical leadership. She's also going to deliver another workshop elsewhere. So if she hops off the screen, it's not because there's anything wrong with the broadcast. It's just that she's got to go and do another thing. Okay. So, Han, I will hand over to you.
Right. Is that there, Rich? Can you see the slides, Ange? I'm hoping you can see the slides. Okay, I'm just reflecting on what Diana and Tom started with. I have been in the profession for 18 years. I have been a leader for 16 years. I've worked in 6 schools. I've worked under 5 head teachers. And I've worked in 3 mats. And that has very much shaped me. You can't see the slides? Oh, sorry. It says share this end. Oh. Rich, what have I done wrong here? Hang on. Sorry, Ange. Can you see it now, Ange? Yes?
No, not yet.
Oh, okay. Right. What I'll do is I'll just talk to my slides and I'll share them later. So I was thinking about that context to what has made me an ethical leader. And one of the icons, one of the metaphors I use quite a lot about ethical leadership is the lighthouse. But I've been reflecting it over the last week, preparing for this. And I actually think that the compass is our values, our internal direction, whereas the lighthouse is that external piece. And with the disruption we've experienced in the last few weeks and months, I think we need our lighthouses more than ever right now. And I'm grateful for you, Angie, in the book and everyone talking today for being those human lighthouses for the system. Just 3 quotes I wanted to share about ethical leadership. A quote I used in my prospectus when I was ahead: educating the mind without educating the heart is no education at all. And I think sometimes our system is head driven rather than heart driven. And I know Viv talks about the need for super hearts rather than super heads in the system. That really resonated with me when she shared that with me a few years ago. There's also a quote about we don't teach morals and ethics and empathy and kindness in the schools. We teach that at home. And I know the families I've served and the communities I've worked with in the last few years, that's not necessarily always the case. And I think it's that partnership between the home and the school and society which actually develops those moral codes and those values and ethics in young people. And then a quote from Anne Frank: a quiet conscience makes one strong. And I think, picking up on Tom's point about humility, I have a problem with the fact that a lot of the leaders who are very loud and dominant are the ones who are listened to. I don't necessarily think we're always listening to the right leaders. And sometimes the ethical leaders are flying under the radar and they're doing their jobs quietly and they're humble and they're modest. And I think sometimes the reason for that is that they are perhaps avoiding being above the parapet and avoiding that criticism because they're just committed to getting on and doing the job. So thinking about sort of like what the definition of ethical leadership is, it is about that governance over our own behaviour. And it is a knowledge base, but it is about our moral principles. And with that 18-year trajectory of me in the system, I only discovered the Nolan principles 2 years ago. And I find that quite staggering, that in my PDCE, in my MPQML, in my MPQSL, and my MPQH, there was not a single reference to the Nolan principles. And I wanted to share the Nolan principles with everyone listening, because if I didn't know what they were, I'm assuming that not all of you know what they are either. And these are the 7 principles of public life. I'm just going to read them out to you: selflessness, integrity, objectivity, accountability, openness, honesty, and leadership. And those 7 statements and values and ethics really resonate with me. And I know the ethical leadership framework 2 years ago has done some work on this and how we apply it in the educational system. But I am still quite shocked that I only found out about them 2 years ago. So where is the messaging to every single person in our organisations about these public accountabilities, these public commitments about how we conduct ourselves? And what I've done, I've just flipped each one into a question, because this is about collective responsibility, collective agency. None of us have all the answers. As Tom said, we all think we're ethical, but we can all name people who are unethical. So for selflessness, do we act solely in terms of the public interest? Because I know I've worked with leaders who are not acting in the interest of others, they are acting in the interest of themselves. For integrity, do we declare and resolve any interests and relationships? Those who've heard me speak before, we know there's a boys' club out there. We know it's about who you know, not what you know. And I think there's a conflict of interest in a lot of relationships in the system. For objectivity, do we act and take decisions impartially, fairly, and on merit without discrimination or bias? I think we all know the answer to that one, particularly with what's going on with the diversity and inclusion agenda right now. There's a lot of discrimination and bias, institutionally, systemically, structurally, and societally, that we need to be the counter narrative for. Accountability. Do we submit ourselves to the scrutiny necessary to ensure this? Well, going back to that thing of a fear of criticism, I think we've got a deficit mindset at the moment, and we're critiquing everything that's wrong rather than celebrating everything that's right. And I like the way Angie framed this session about we are here to celebrate the system, and we need an abundance mindset, and we need an appreciative inquiry perspective. We are celebrating and sharing what is working rather than critiquing what isn't working. For openness, do we act and take decisions in an open and transparent way? Well, I've worked in schools where promotions are done behind closed doors. People are talked out for going for interviews and offered promotions behind a door without an advert going out. And I know from everyone I work with, there is that lack of transparency in a lot of schools. And the sixth one, honesty. Do we always tell the truth? I think everyone likes to think they're honest and everyone likes to think they're truthful, but are we telling the full truth, the whole truth, the painful truth, the uncomfortable truth? And number 7, leadership. Do we challenge poor behaviour wherever it occurs? I'd say not. I've worked in a lot of schools where I've been a whistleblower, and we've had people who have basically kept their heads down and tried to avoid the conflict because it's easier to get on with their jobs than it is to call out those poor behaviours. And we do need collective agency and collective responsibility around calling out and challenging the poor behaviours. And if we think about role models right now in the system, in society, in the world, who are the ethical leaders who we look to as our beacons? Because for me, it would be Jacinda Ardern. I think she's an amazing ethical leader, and she is leading with courage and compassion and empathy and kindness. And that's the kind of leadership I want to see in this country. And just to finish with a couple of quotes. A quote from Browne. I am not here to be right. I'm here to get it right. I think we need to remember that sometimes, that people like to take the position of authority, that they are the rightness. And if we look at all of these principles through the lens of diversity and inclusion, that might actually help us move the agenda forward. And in the words of Martin Luther King, the time is always right to do what is right. So let's get on with it.
Thank you, Hannah. Thank you so much. And thank you for bringing the Noden principles into this. We also now have a framework for ethical leadership in education. Well, you know, a framework has been brought together, and I think it's interesting. There have been a few comments in the chat around the disconnect sometimes between some of the behaviours that we see of educators. Social media is a bit of a difficult place to really comment on, but we do see behaviours sometimes on social media that certainly feel uncomfortable to me sometimes when I see them. Some of the behaviours of us, you know, the way that we engage in discussion and the way that we support or challenge each other as educators. And I was really interested when I was writing the book at thinking about where communities now find leadership. And it really struck me that we do need to take so seriously the responsibility that we have as educators to being social leaders, to being leaders in our communities, because there is little else to really hold on to. We have communities that have lost faith in politicians for many reasons. We have communities that are not always bound together by their spiritual communities. We have, you know, we live in a largely secular society, and so there aren't necessarily places that people feel really leadership is taking place and leaders who they can follow are not necessarily abounding. And I think that the school has a really central role to play in the absence of other leadership. So it's always very interesting to see the way that to think about the way that we show up as those leaders in the public domain, and to think about whether we are really allowing those ethical principles to flow through everything that we do, and when we're not, to own up to maybe getting it wrong or maybe examining our behaviours. So Hannah, thanks so much for bringing that perspective. Okay, so just a reminder, if you have any questions, then please type them into the comments box. Hannah Wilson is going to need to leave also a little bit early, so if you have questions for Hannah and we don't get to ask them of her, then I will tag her into questions on Twitter later. So I'm going to hand over to Darren now. Darren, it would be lovely if you could introduce yourself and share your 5 minutes with us on ethical leadership.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, great. Well, thanks, Angela, for inviting me, and congratulations on the publication of what I think is a really important book. Yeah, my name's Darren Chetty. I'm a teaching fellow at UCL. I'm going to read a little bit. I can speak off the cuff. I'm not as good as stopping when I speak off the cuff, so this should keep me to 5 minutes. Ethical school leadership. I think there's a lived tension between the ethical and the school leadership. I think possibly even that it's an oxymoron. Why? Well, because school leaders are under continuous pressure to compensate for society. That famous headline from Basil Bernstein of education cannot compensate for society, and Stephen Gorard more recently saying education can compensate for society a bit. But nevertheless, whatever's amiss in society, it's put on schools and ultimately on school leaders to somehow fix it. So with the question of lighting the way and leadership, I think there are two questions I want to think about today. Where are we being led to, and how are we traveling? This is something I've shared a little bit of this before. It might be familiar to some people. In 2015, our then Ofsted chief, Michael Wilshaw, praised head teachers who were battlers and bruisers and run a tight ship. And I wanted to zoom in on this phrase, run a tight ship, because I hear it often with regards to school. And I think in some places, at least, it's growing in popularity. It positions head teachers as captain of the ship, teachers presumably as their crew, students perhaps as cargo on their learning journey towards destination life success, and Sir Michael presumably as the admiral of the fleet. Now, metaphors fascinate me for what they can reveal, and it's possible I've stretched this one a little too far, but I'd suggest that particular maritime metaphor hints at a style of leadership that's strictly top-down, that's resistant to dialogue, to distributed leadership, to diversification of thought, and potentially to diversification of people. The prevalence of maritime metaphors in the English language perhaps grows out of the fact that Great Britain as an island and the large role that sailing and the Navy played in Britain's shape identity and how it made its money, and indeed how it shaped the modern world. And while it was philosophers and scientists who were developing theories and pseudo-theories of race, it was those who sailed off to far lands who provided the urgent need for intellectual justifications for the differential treatment of those whom they encountered. These maritime metaphors, to a greater or lesser extent, come out of Britain's colonial past. Our island story is a global story. Even when not working in a school where head teacher speaks of themselves as the captain of the ship, teachers may still find themselves being urged to, quote, pull together or to get on board with a school policy or a new initiative. And I think this is becoming more prevalent. In my 20 years as a primary teacher, I witnessed a shift from staff meetings as opportunities for professional discussion to the presentation of non-negotiable demands and information on how compliance would be evidenced. And often senior leaders would justify these sessions as orders from above, as what Ofsted want, as what the government want. So we needed to pull together, get on board, and essentially obey the chain of command. But sometimes rocking the boat is an ethical course of action. Here I'd like to quote Derek Bell, the Harvard law professor who gave up his tenured position in protest at the university's continued refusal to hire a woman of color. He says, one of the most powerful ways by which we can resist the temptations all around us is by maintaining a stance that reminds us and shows others how much more we are than simple adherence to whatever the current consensus happens to be. We move beyond the popular and let the in crowd go its way. We look instead to those who love us for support and criticism. We rely on faith in a power or cause that surpasses understanding to sustain us. With this foundation, we achieve our successes, when we do, with moral and political integrity. With this foundation, our successes become not just personal triumphs, but victories for our entire communities. Like many people here, I suspect, I've sat through numerous CPD days and staff meetings where we've been asked to list the values of our school: supportive, inclusive, challenging, fairness. We all know the kind of things that emerge, variations on the Nolan principles. We know the values to espouse, and we see schools espousing these values on their websites, in mission statements, and written policies. But who and what we value is just as important as our personal values. And ideally, our espoused values would match our enacted values, so that what we do matches what we say we want to do. Imagine visiting a school, maybe your school, and looking at the photo board of staff, looking at the displays of student work, reading through curriculum documents, attending governors' meetings and PTA meetings, attending the assemblies where students are praised and rewarded for their endeavours, and then unpicking from all that you've witnessed the enacted values of the school. Whose lives have been shown to have value? How closely do the enacted values resemble the espoused values? How might we reduce the gap between what we say we do and what we actually do? How can we stop children and talented teachers from jumping ship?
Oh, Darren, thank you so much. Thank you so much. That was just sensational, and I love. I'm an English teacher who doesn't think that one can stretch a metaphor too far. So stretch on, I say. That metaphor can run and run for the rest of the day and the weekend. I think that there'll be some questions that I would love to come to towards the end, Darren. But I think in particular, where are we being led and how are we travelling? Is something that maybe the panel can reflect on, and we can talk a bit about that. Thank you so much for the provocation, and also for writing something as well. It was much appreciated. Okay, so we are right on time, and I'm going to hand over to Viv.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Angie, and thank you everyone who's spoken before me. It feels a real privilege to be here, as everyone has said, and I've been really provoked just listening to Darren. And in terms of what I'm going to share with my take on ethical leadership, this really comes from a very personal perspective and also professional perspective, in terms of what I am seeing very present at this moment in time, working with head teachers I so closely am, in terms of how they are seeking to lead from a place of what is right for them, being ethical. And I'm going to use a phrase called the tragic gap, and I have prepared something as well, so I will be reading. So, for me, ethical leadership is about how we as leaders learn to stand in the tragic gap. Now, I appreciate this may be a term that many of you are not familiar with, but the tragic gap is a term coined by the American author and activist Parker Palmer, a term he uses to describe the middle ground we so often find ourselves in, where on one side of the gap, we are faced with the difficult realities of life, and then on the opposite side, we catch sight of our hopes and our dreams to make this world a better place. And I think we'd all know that, we can all relate to the fact that over these past few months, we've all experienced to varying degrees the impact of difficult and sometimes tragic realities of life. We have all seen how our lives have been changed by the COVID-19 pandemic, and we have all witnessed, and some like myself, in very personal ways, the deep, deep wounds of racism that urgently need to be healed. And I really feel that in times like this, when we're exploring what does ethical leadership mean for us, in terms of working with this notion of a tragic gap, we as leaders have to work out, how can we hold the tension between what is and what could be? And how standing in the tragic gap can our actions give new hope for the struggles of our time? And so I'd like to offer just 3 solutions. This first one, I think, relates to a point that Tom made earlier about defences, and how when people respond to us in a certain way, how our own internal response can actually negate actions that are required of us. So first of all, we need to become comfortable with feelings of discomfort. We all know there's a lot of discomfort in this world right now, and that discomfort is being mirrored in our schools now, and it is going to be mirrored when we all return in whatever shape or form in September. So whatever role we play in schools, we all need to help individuals lean into these places of discomfort, but it starts with us. If we can't engage with our own internal discomfort and feelings that we have, particularly around the race issue now, I'm going to say quite loudly, you're going to be rubbish. You're not going to be able to provide the support that our school leaders need right now around this area. 2, we need to ask what agenda is now demanding my attention. And by this, I don't necessarily mean the public agenda. So you need to be really clear when you hear me say this, because I also mean the private agenda, the internal agenda. If we are going to take an ethical stand in the tragic gap, and if our actions are going to be the right actions, don't rush. We've got to turn inwards first. and ensure that the actions that we take are aligned with our deepest values and our deepest truths. And then the third, and I'm going to use a phrase that maybe some of you might not be familiar with, but we need to take full responsibility for our own individuation process. And by that, I mean that we take full adult responsibility for recognizing that we are all involved in a lifelong project of moving towards wholeness and becoming our best selves. And I would argue that not to be cognizant of the fact can mean that sometimes in the tragic gap, we become stuck. And we don't realize we've become stuck because we are so unfamiliar in education. And those of you who know me, when I talk about, the work of the soul and who we are, we just don't understand it. We don't know how to listen to the deepest stirrings. And so what happens? We ignore them. We become busy. We look for external validation. And then what happens is we are only affirmed for doing. We are not affirmed for being and being who we need to be. So in conclusion, I just want to say that we grow as ethical leaders in seeking to make this world a better place when we all understand that there is a tragic gap in which we all stand. And our task is to help to close that gap. And we can do that first of all by paying attention to who we are and how we choose to show up in the world.
Viv, thank you so much. So inspiring. And also want to say to Viv and to anyone that hasn't worked with Viv Grant, that the work of the soul and the way in which Viv invites people in coaching with her to really dive in is the work that has been extraordinarily influential on the way that I have approached leadership. So my first conversation with Viv is the conversation that launched me into this sense of the deep importance of knowing myself first as a leader. And I invite anyone who hasn't worked with Viv or integrity coaching to really consider that hard, because that's the stuff of weathering the storms. That's the work. Thank you so much, Viv. And the tragic gap is interesting. I haven't heard you talk about the tragic gap, but the title for the book, Lighting the Way, comes from a book that I read by a woman called Nancy Duarte, and lighting the way is a reference to leaders being torchbearers and holding a light towards a new reality, and lighting the way between now and there, what lies ahead. So I'm really interested, I'm interested in liminal spaces, I'm interested in the travel, I'm interested in the journey, I'm interested in the way that we travel. But I think having that, being able to accommodate that discomfort of not being there yet, but being on the way there, is part of what we need to bring to it. So thank you so much for articulating that so beautifully. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Kieran. I'm just going to remind people that if Hannah disappears, it's not because there's a technical fault, it's because she's also multitasking this morning. If you have any questions for Viv, for Darren, for Tom, for Mary, for Kieran, then put them into the chat and we will hopefully get to them towards the end. But Kieran, over to you.
Here I go. Sorry, guys. Classic online unmuting problem. Thanks so much, Angie, for having me. And I do feel very privileged to be on such an amazing panel talking about such an amazing topic, or an important topic, of ethical leadership. And I think the reason, Angie, that you asked me to talk about ethical leadership. So for clarity, I lead a charity which works with school leaders. So it's all a bit meta. And I'll be talking a lot about them and the community of school leaders that I work with in the next 5 minutes. But the topic that's brought us together is what I think of as a lens on vulnerability. It's a group of children who I think are the pinnacle of what it means to be ethical if we can include them in our schools. They're the children who are much more likely to live in poverty, who are overwhelmingly likely to have special educational needs, particularly social, emotional, mental health needs, and children who are 20 times more likely to engage with social services. And those are children excluded from school. And I run a charity called The Difference, which is about developing the leadership in schools, which can seek to address the issue of school exclusion, because it is affecting our most vulnerable learners. It is an ethical challenge for the whole profession. Everybody's not getting it right at the moment. And what is one or two, or in terms of fixed exclusions, maybe many more in an individual school, when we zoom out, it's this national picture that it's our most vulnerable children that are being affected by school exclusion. So it's a really pertinent topic when we're talking about ethical leadership. And Angie has written a chapter in Lighting the Way about exclusions, and kindly referenced some of my work, which I published with IPPR and did with the Timpson Review. And I wanted to share kind of 3 hopeful messages about how we can light the way towards ethical leadership, particularly on reducing exclusion and having better outcomes for excluded learners. And at The Difference, we talk about those 3 kind of things that light the way as people, perception and practice. So I'm going to talk about those 3 things. So first, people. Well, when I was doing the IPPR research and then supporting the Timpson Review, the independent review on exclusions, what we found, a common theme, was that leaders were the people who made the difference. Absolutely. So they set culture in a school. We've talked about the high stress accountability, and that stress can very often, I'm sure we've all seen it, flow down from a head feeling stressed to their senior team, to their staff, to the students. And it is the most vulnerable, those students who are most stressed outside of school, who are most vulnerable to that stress inside of school and to that interacting with them and leading to behaviour that can escalate. But leaders can set the culture, make the difference between a stressful and a supportive school environment. They also set their orientation to the community. And they decide when they lead, right, we're going to open the gates. We're going to be listening to parents. This is the way in which we're going to run things. And they set challenge to their colleagues internally, but also externally. You know, when Edward and I were doing some of the visits of local authorities with higher and lower exclusions, Tom's mentioned the fair access panels, but that was a real feature. We saw heads challenging other heads collaboratively and positively around the FAP and saying, whoa, wait 1 minute, I'm not going to take that student from you on a managed move, because what I see there with that student is so similar to so-and-so, who actually we managed to include. Why don't I link your deputy up with my deputy, and let's share some practice here and see if we can do something different. And that was the pattern. So that's a light of the way, is people, that we do see that where leaders are truly committed and constantly willing to learn, that they can push things and build more inclusive cultures in schools, in their communities, in their local authorities. And that's why The Difference runs 2 programs for leaders, so our main program is the Difference Leaders program. We try and bring fantastic teachers to work in pupil referral units for 2 years, serving that community really intensely and learning from their colleagues on their way to deputy headship in mainstream and becoming head teachers. And we share some of that practice with mainstream teachers, our inclusive leaders, who are current serving deputies, assistant heads and heads, who come and learn with them at a kind of a suite of work about recognising that all children have learning, well-being and safeguarding needs. And if we share practice, then we can improve what we do in the school with them. So that's people. The second is perception. And I think it's so powerful, the title, Angie, that this is what we need. We need to light the way. We've talked here about high stress and potentially So Becky Allen, who wrote The Teacher Gap and is a great academic in education, she talks about mimetic behaviours when she talks about why bad practice spreads. And I really passionately believe that no leader wakes up wanting to be unethical. No teacher gets into the classroom thinking, yeah, you know what, I want to do this job so that I can exclude my most vulnerable learners. That's not how things work. And Tom's talked about those competing pressures and those trade-offs that make you make decisions. But Becky Allen talks about mimetic behaviour, where there's a high stress. We have to achieve these goals, but there's not a lot of support in practice and what that looks like, how to get there. Instead, we're mimetic, we copy, we look at what others are doing. And I think we've seen that drive some not ethical practices in the profession over the last 10 years. But we can also see it drive professional and ethical practices. And I'm really excited by the book doing that, lighting the way, and by us finding the schools that are flying under the radar, as Hannah says, humbly being inclusive and actually raising them up, raising their visibility, allowing others to see them and feel inspired, their perception that now this thing that I thought was impossible, maybe it is possible. And then the final thing, I don't know how long I've got left. How long have I got left, Angie? Shall I shut up? 1 minute. Okay, great. I won't shut up. So the third thing is practice. And that links to what I'm saying about Becky. You know, I don't think that people wake up deciding to be unethical. But I think when we can't see the practice and what it looks like, we potentially take the shortest route from A to B because we don't know the most effective route from A to B. But I think the practice that I see in the schools that we work with, and some of the mainstream schools have successfully over this year reduced the numbers of fixed term exclusions, reduced the numbers of periods out of class, detentions, and the managed moves that need to be made in the school. Part of what they are doing is a real courageous leadership of being willing to look at what's not working and being able to model for staff teams their own fallibility, being able to model the mistakes, the apologies, the learning that they want to see. And it's exactly what you're describing, Angie, that is the power of leadership, being able to let your staff see that you can get things wrong with children. And that's particularly important when we think about exclusion, because so much of the time when things are out of control for a young person and they are spiraling, it's actually that conflict between a staff member and a student, which can spark things that then escalate through exclusions towards a permanent exclusion and expulsion from school. But it's when we can be willing to be wrong, when we can go to a student and unpick a situation with encouraging them to apologise to us, but also noting when we ourselves became non-rational, when our prefrontal cortex wasn't working anymore because we were flooded with adrenaline and cortisol, and actually we did something we shouldn't have done, or we escalated that situation. And it's those brave, courageous leaders who are showing how they can do that with students and how they can do that with staff, creating a repairing culture and a compassionate culture that you talk about, Angie, that we are seeing practice change in schools and systems being built that allow that reset, allow that forgiveness and that compassion. So I think there's lots to be hopeful for. And this book particularly, I'm excited to be sharing with the leaders that I work with, because I think it is about doing what you're doing, Angie, which is lighting the way.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Kieran. And speaking as somebody who has been a head teacher of a pupil referral service, has led in alternative provision for a large part of my career, it was particularly important for me to write a chapter on exclusions, which I do not think are necessarily have to be handled in the way that we feel as school leaders we are bound to handle them. And it's really tricky territory. And I think that the reason that we handle it badly is because it's tricky, and because there is such a human dimension tied with a legal dimension, and we don't always get it right. And we are scared to say often as school leaders, I don't know what I'm doing here, and I don't know if I'm going to get it right. So one of the things I really urge people to do in the book is to know what the law is, know where you stand, and then find your human position and work out what you are going to need to do, or what you are going to bring to the topic of exclusions, because getting this wrong has such significant implications for young people and for our society moving on. So I'm delighted to reference your work, because I think your work is brilliant, and thank you so much for being here. I'm going to hand over to Mary now. It's 11:54. We're not doing too badly. We're probably not going to have time for questions, but I am going to take all of the questions that have been asked so far, and I'm going to try and get them answered on Twitter and tag people in, so fear not. Mary.
Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be part of this panel. Well done, Angie. Terrific work. Inspiring, just listening to everyone else. I feel my words are going to be really banal by comparison, but here goes. I just want to bring us back to grounding this notion of ethical leadership, because one of my concerns is that it can be a thing out there. And actually, what I would make the case for is that it's a way of being, a way of living, a way of working day by day. And at the heart of it is holding myself to account. And then I can hold others to account. But what slightly concerns me about this is that I don't know what my blind spots are. And so that means I can think that I'm a good person, but unless I'm open to other people saying, you've got this wrong, Mary, then actually I'm just paying lip service to the space of ethical leadership. And so for me, it has to come from a place of lived out humility, which is easier said than done when you think you've got it right. I also think that what you do speaks so loudly that people won't hear what you say. You can have all the fine words in the world, but if your values are not lived out day by day and they're just laminated, to paraphrase Contender Charlie, on a website, people spot that a mile off. And so it's about being alert to that. And on the notion of being alert, I know for myself, this is something that I have to keep refreshed. There can never be any sense that one's work is done. At the moment, I'm reading If This Be a Man, Primo Levi's account of his time in concentration camp. And that happened 12 years before I was born. That degradation of one human being to another just 12 years before I was born. And the likelihood is that this is going on unknown, possibly in China, we don't know. But I've got an obligation to keep alert to that slippery slope where good people get caught up in something that ultimately dehumanizes a whole society. So I don't want to sound too extreme about this, but I think from very small things of holding myself to account means that I'm less likely to be derailed in the long term. So I just want to finish with something that I find incredibly helpful as I go through thinking about how we hold ourselves to account through being human beings first and professionals second. And that's Rosabeth Moskanter's 6 keys. Moskanter is an academic at Harvard, and she's identified the characteristics of lots of companies which are doing well at the bottom line, but are also doing good things ethically. So very quickly, because I'm conscious of time. So the first is show up. Let's turn up on our work in our complete selves, not just physically. Speak up. We've got to say what we believe to be right, and at the same time allow others to have their space to speak. Look up. What's the higher vision that we are tapping into when we go to work each day? Team up. By and large, things are better when we do stuff together. Never give up. I mean, we're kidding ourselves. If this work is easy, there's going to be times when we come against a brick wall. So we regroup, we have team up. Never give up, I've said. And the final one is lift others up. I think one of the greatest things we can do to live this out is to encourage other people. So lift others up whenever we get the opportunity, and to be grateful to those who encourage us as well. So my final thoughts, well done, Angie. I think this is a really important piece of work. And let's remember, we're human beings first, we're professionals second, that the young people we work with, they're human beings first and they're learners second. Well done.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Mary. Thank you so much, everybody. Look at that. It's 11:59. We're awesome. All of us. Amazing. I am going to gather up questions and I'm going to put them out and tweet them, and I'm going to tag people in, because I do want to respect the time that people have given up this morning, and I would like to finish on time. I would like to just offer a final thought, really, which is that this morning I wanted to demonstrate, I guess, that we have, this panel is really diverse. It's a really eclectic, if you like, group of people who are working in education, and we don't necessarily, I might agree with the opinions and views and outlooks of all of you, and I might not, and that wouldn't matter, because I feel that the dimension of your work that I have met has touched me in a way that makes me think, I wonder what you've got to say about ethical leadership. And that's the thing that I guess I want this book to provoke, is that we can work with each other, human beings first, regardless of our politics and our position and all of those things. And we can meet each other in that place where we say, interesting idea. I hadn't thought about it like that. Let me reconsider. So I basically invite you to write, to blog, to think about, to spend your time considering the journey that you're on, considering the journey and how you travel. Thank you, Darren, for that. And to connect on this conversation around what it means to be an ethical leader, to be a human being first, and maybe an educator second, over the blissful summer holiday that you're all about to experience. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us, and thank you to the panel again for being here. It means a lot. And you're really welcome to share your books. Thanks, guys.